we can then distill the similarity, the essence of the concept. So this is what we're attempting to do. So this is a quote from, at the very bottom of page 39 in my notes. This is a direct quote from Nietzsche, note 141, and it's going to explain what the conscience for him, how it was created. Remember, it's a product of the sacerdotal class. So, in this way, the famous conscience is at last created. Emphasis, right? It is created. It doesn't exist inherently. It is a product of manufactured, intentful design. Okay. So in this way, the famous conscience is at last created. An inner voice which does not measure the value of every action with regard to its consequence, but with regard to its intention. And this is important, right? What's important in assessing the conscience, right, when we talk about this, is not projecting to try and determine what the consequences are, but what is the intent behind and motivating my action, right? And I talked earlier about Immanuel Kant's shopkeeper examples. It's not so much that my actions are good consequently. It's that my actions are motivated, informed by an intent that is itself good. So both the intent, and I did this lecture already, right? Both the intent and the action have to conform to the moral law, not just the action. Okay? If the action only conforms to the moral law, then the action is still classified as immoral. The action and the intent have to conform for the action to be classified as moral under this account. So, but with regard to its intention and the degree to which this intention, as I just said, conforms to the law, right? So it's not just the action, both the action and the intent. And he classifies this as the conscience, right? The conscience is there as, if you will, a precondition for our intentionality, to be sort of technical, right? Our intentionality is itself situated within. It's a part of the overall structure of conscience, which is fabricated. So in a sense, if conscience is fabricated, right, and conscience is used to motivate the intent, then you can see how our intent is then influenced by any external source motivating our conscience, right? And that's the idea. Again, this is all sort of, we're going through this a little bit quicker, but we've already had this discussion, so hopefully I didn't go through that bit just now. I felt like I went through that a little quickly, but I've discussed this earlier. Okay, second, and if you need a refresher, just, Control F, note 141, and in the document, and just read up. Find out what section of the video it is, and watch those videos again if you need a refresher. So, second, one must identify the nature of the teeth or the bite, right? If we say it's the bite of conscience, and we know now that conscience is instrumental in necessitating, I'm going to be technical now, right? If we are talking about the bite of conscience, the first thing to do, the easy thing, is to figure out what conscience is, because we already discussed it, and then we'll analyze bite, right? So I'll actually draw this, write this down so you can have a visual, right? The bite of conscience. The easy thing is to figure out what this is, because we've already done this. We recognize, and then we'll do this. We recognize that conscience is a manner in which conscience informs intent. So there's a relationship, there's not inherent, there's a constructed or designed, willfully designed relationship between conscience, which has been created, and intent. So that conscience informs our intent. Right? So, quick example. The example that I've used before. I want to lie to somebody in order to manipulate them out of their life savings. Pretty bad example, right? As far as deplorable, I guess. So I want to lie and use my sort of persuasive power to manipulate somebody out of their life savings. And I go to the house and I'm just about to knock, and my conscience kicks in. And my conscience is like, you really shouldn't do this. You really shouldn't try and take this from somebody else, because they worked hard for that money, and it's just not right. Nietzsche would say that that idea, that conscience, if it is informed, and it would have to be for Nietzsche, informed by some external source, it's not something that I'm appealing to sort of my own rational deliberation, to be technical, I'm appealing to some external source, then that moral imperative is going to influence my conscience. And my conscience then is going to influence my intent. So that I would recognize, you know what, I can't, my intent's bad. You know, I'm intending to swindle this person, I can't do it. And then I just, I go back to the car and I decide not to knock on the door. Right? So in a sense, if you want to think about this, it doesn't necessarily have to be as formulaic as this. I'm not saying that it is inherently formulaic in this manner, but I think pedagogically it's sound to understand sort of the parts. Right? You have the moral imperative. Right? You have the moral imperative, which we recognize, we have the moral imperative as one, which we recognize the highest moral values collapse, right? So Nietzsche wouldn't even ascribe to this. So the moral imperative then is used to inform this fabricated, designed, created structure called conscience. Right? So the moral imperative needs to refer to something. It needs to point to something. And not only does it have to refer to something and point to something, it has to refer and point to something in every single human being that conforms to the moral imperative. So this moral imperative, right, the moral imperative, just so that you understand, right, if we're talking about, let's say, Christian religious tradition, then the entire community of the 100 million, billion Christians that there are all going to have to receive and understand and conform to this moral imperative. How do they do that? What Nietzsche said previously, and this is now me amending the discussion, sort of augmenting it rather, I'm going to give you a little bit more information, is that the sacerdotal class, the priestly class, recognized that they had to create within each individual a sort of transmitter-receiver, if you want to think in terms of sort of contemporary wireless communication, right? The moral imperative, might be a gross example, but I think it's clear for a lot of people understand transmitter-receiver sort of discourse. The moral imperative transmits the rules. You have to do this. It transmits this, it sends the rules out into the universe, if you will. In order to be a good Christian, you must do, sends that information. Well, that information has to be received on the part of someone trying to get that information, right? That information is received, obviously, by the moral agent. And the conscience, our conscience, within the mind of the moral agent, right? Within the mind of the moral agent is the receiver, if you will. And that receiver is our conscience, right? And this conscience has to be implanted, if you will, in the mind of every single moral agent. So, how do you do this? You create commandments. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. You have to do this, right? Ba, 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 ba. You know what the rules are now, right? We've implanted in your mind the rules for proper governance. Insofar as you receive those rules, and you keep those rules embedded in your head, sort of like metaphorically speaking, right? You keep those rules embedded in your head, then at the point of decision making, you find yourself at an intersection, you're like, oh wow, this action is governed by this rule, right? This action, I've done this a million times already, right? This action is governed by a rule, and that rule says not to do that. So there's no reason to have rational deliberation because my conscience automatically refers to the source code, if you will. It automatically refers to the moral imperative. Moral imperative told me to do this, and now I've received that information and I do this. So there has to be a structure of reception. And that structure of reception is, according to Nietzsche, been totally fabricated, and it's the conscience, right? So we have the moral imperative, and we have sort of the implant of the conscience as a means of receiving the instructions from the law. And then obviously action follows immediately from the reception of the law, right? And if you refuse to conform, if it says not to do X, and you do X, then there's punishment and judgment, and we've talked